Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a very pleasant Wednesday morning here in suburban Chicago. October 7th, I believe, is the date. And I'm coming to you with a recording of some poorly thought out academic work. Well, okay. So when I told you in my last episode, I went to an academic conference this weekend and I talked about a couple games, and I thought I would give a kind of recap of my conversation there to give you an idea of the kinds of things I'm thinking about and try to figure out, sort of out loud talking to you, whether I should pursue this as a publishable paper or if it was just an interesting meditation. So the starting point for this moment is twofold. One, the conversation about colonialism in board games has been on my mind for the last couple years. I've mentioned it a number of times, I'm sure. There are a few games that I've heard are very good, but I've kind of resisted playing because of the colonialist theme, particularly Mombasa and Maracaibo. And I'm just less and less interested in games in which the story is human beings taking over land belonging to other human beings. So there's one bit. The second bit is the conversation we've been having in the board game community and on this podcast about H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft is, of course, a problematic figure because of his terrible racist views. But, thinking about the way that his mythos functions and the role that other people have had in creating it and the way that it perpetuates a lot of different ideas that exceed what Lovecraft was doing are all really interesting and useful. Somebody pointed out to me the other day that the Evil Hat Productions game, the Call of Cthulhu game, I think it was Call of Cthulhu, has a really good preface in the most recent edition where they say, there's nothing we can do about it. H.P. Lovecraft was a horrible racist. But here's why we still play this game. Interesting. So that's part two. Part three is the subject of this conversation, and that's the two games that are in my favorites list, and from the person I still consider my favorite designer, Martin Wallace, and that is Australia and A Study in Emerald. So here's my general thinking about these and why I think this is interesting to look at as a case study. I want to preface this by saying this is by no means a critique of Martin Wallace's work generally or these games in particular. I'm just interested in the situation. I think Australia is an interesting case in thinking about the ramifications of the choices we make. So in A Study in Emerald, if you haven't read the story, it's a Cthulhu-type story set in the Sherlock Holmes world, written by Neil Gaiman. And the premise is that in 1180 AD, I don't remember exactly why that particular moment, the elder gods of the Cthulhu universe showed up on Earth and took over the royal houses of Europe. And from that point until the mid-1800s, the progression of the human race has been heavily shaped by those elder gods. They've apparently had a travel ban restricted. Travel has been restricted for most of the world. They have curtailed or shaped the evolution of, evolution isn't the right word, the growth of human culture, and have reshaped the earth for their own ends. There is a resistance movement among humans called the Restorationists, who seek to restore humankind's freedom, and the Loyalists, who are loyal to our elder god masters. That's the premise at the heart of the story, A Study in Emerald. And the board game, A Study in Emerald by Martin Wallace, plays out in that world. Wallace, in his designer notes, said that he had read a really interesting book about anarchists of the 1800s and their goals and philosophy. And he said he thought there was enough stuff there to make for a really interesting game, but he wasn't confident that it would be well received to have a game where your goal is to go around blowing up world leaders. Fair enough. He says in the notes that he had read A Study in Emerald, and it occurred to him that the story was a good transposition of ideas because if the elder gods are the ones you're blowing up, any sympathy we had for them is removed from the game. And then you can enjoy the game playing it out. Even if you're on the side of the elder gods, you enjoy playing it out because you're not really thinking about the human cost, because you're not blowing up humans. It's a fantasy world at this point. I'm putting some of my explanation in there, but he says any sympathy for the elder gods is removed. And sure, and it works for me. There's an interesting parallel, I think, or corollary element, when the elder gods are the Lovecraftian elder gods because of Lovecraft's history of racism. There's a really interesting piece, I will link to it in the show notes, called Why We Cannot Ignore H.P. Lovecraft's White Supremacy. And the premise of that piece is that built into the heart of Lovecraft's ideas are his worldviews, particularly worldviews about race. And things that end up, I've talked about this before, things that end up working as metaphors still end up building in the kind of xenophobia and racism that was part of his worldview, even in stories that don't really tell stories about that. Right? The fear of the unknown is in some ways a fear of other people. Not entirely, not uniformly, but it's worth keeping in mind. So when we have a game that uses the Lovecraftian story, I think it's imperative that we consider how that story plays out. And here's where the part I think it's interesting. So in A Study in Emerald, we're fighting against the Lovecraftian monsters, and those monsters are in positions of power in the world, that they are dominating and subjugating human beings. So in effect, we're punching up, right? The villains of the piece are cruel to all people. And so it doesn't connect in the same way to this idea of racism, at least not as strongly. There's still some fear of the idea of like the other being in charge, right? If you look at xenophobic propaganda from World War I, all this stuff about sort of the Hun attacking or whatever, right? That is World War II propaganda with the sort of racist depiction of Japanese people. These are xenophobic in the same way, and the fear is we would be ruled by these horrible others. Nonetheless, I feel like within the Study in Emerald, because the villains of the piece are in power, it removes, and they're individuals, it's not a seething horde, it's these sort of elder gods themselves. And I feel like the game allows us to play without so much concern about the nature of the people. But more importantly, this is the part that I hit on in my paper, Wallace is using the Lovecraftian characters to help us ignore or remove narratively the figures we wouldn't want to see as part of a narrative game where you're trying to kill them, right? So a narrative game where you're trying to blow up world leaders maybe is problematic. A narrative game where you're trying to blow up elder gods is not. That's my point. And what we're eliding there is the struggle the struggle against royalty by anarchists. Okay, I think you understand what I'm getting at. So then we have Australia. The follow-up game to A Study in Emerald, Wallace releases a game that continues the story of A Study in Emerald. The premise is that at the end of A Study in Emerald, the Restorationists won, and the Elder Gods were defeated and taken out of power. Some people think they were killed, some people think they left, but who knows where they went. Because they had been in charge since 1180, and this is all in the sort of introductory text in the rulebook, travel in the human world travel throughout the world had been heavily curtailed. The Elder Gods had not allowed human beings to move around. The implication of the game is that the only places human beings were allowed to live is Europe and North America, that the rest of the world was unpopulated. It's unclear, the game does not indicate or does not specifically articulate the idea that the Elder Gods wiped out all humankind in the rest of the world. Rather, just they didn't let human beings travel. And then so, in the 50 years since the Elder Gods were just deposed, this game takes place in the 1920s or 30s, I think, human beings have started exploring the world and have advanced in leaps and bounds with their weaponry and their technology, and have now found Australia and are settling it to gain the natural resources there, the gold and minerals, and build farms and stuff. When they do that, they discover that in fact the elder gods had not gone away, but rather retreated to these outpost holdouts and gone to sleep. And so now that people are settling on Australia, we're waking them up. That's the premise of the game. Mechanically, it's really interesting. So the elder gods in Australia have a marker in the game that makes them a sort of separate player. As we play, we wrestle with one another for points, for control, points and whatever. But then also the elder gods, we're trying to undermine their control as well. They act like another player. At the end of the game, if they have more points than any of the players, then we lose. You kind of understand that. So here's the part that I find interesting. Whereas A Study in Emerald was a deck building area control game, Australia is a railroad network building game built around this basic premise of colonizing Australia. And the implied narrative in the rulebook is that the elder gods wiped out all of humankind everywhere in the world. It doesn't actually say that, though. And here's the part that I find really interesting. And Martin Wallace does not say this, and I'm not even saying he thought it. He may have just, this is the narrative he came up with, and again, no ill will here. But I find it interesting that in the first A Study in Emerald game, the elder gods stand in for the thing we don't want to think about, namely the killing of world leaders. Specifically, it says that. And in particular, the ideas of the anarchists who are trying to overthrow the ruling class in the 1800s. Here's the part that I find interesting and worth talking about or thinking about. In Australia, the people, the thing that the elder gods make us not have to think about is the indigenous population of Australia. In the previous game, it was the royalty we weren't thinking about, or that we didn't have sympathy for. In this game, it's the Aboriginal people, and this is the place where I find the way the theme integrates a little troubling, is that the British settling of Australia resulted in a lot of Aboriginal people being killed. That when the British started building colonies and presumably railroads and whatnot, and I will admit my understanding of the British settlement of Australia is very weak, but when they started doing that, they found the Aboriginal people and generally exterminated them or captured them pretty much in the same way that white Americans settling North America did to the indigenous people of North America. But so there's an element here where the game doesn't want us to think about the unpleasantness of the colonizing of Australia. And it feels like the explanation of the elder gods as living in the outback and the implication that they had killed human beings on the rest of the planet means that we don't feel sympathy for the elder gods who are living there in the same way that we wouldn't feel sympathy for the elder gods when they are in the royal houses. And thus the game removes the social concern at the heart of the narrative being created. If this had been a game about settling Australia and it was the local population that we disturbed and had to fight, the game would not have been well received. It would have been roundly criticized for its colonizing views. But by eliding that experience and putting the elder gods in instead, we now have a story where we can enjoy that perspective. So there's a couple interesting, for me, really interesting questions to be asked here in the context of this game. I guess for myself, why does it not bother me the same way? That when I play Australia, is that narrative salve must be enough. That because I don't find myself bothered about the colonizing of Australia in this game the same way I am bothered by other games that have a colonialist view. And admittedly, it helps that the game is in an alternate world, and it does have this implication, and it does go out of its way to create a space where there is not this conflict that happened in real world. But there is a part of me that is a little disturbed by how easy it is for me to shift into that space. But it also begs a second question, which is, I think, the larger one to be asked of game designers. And again, No critique on Martin Wallace here. But when some people are talking about game design, I think Jane McGonigal is the one I've heard do this, but I might be wrong about that. It's the conversation about which verbs the game is using. And I've mentioned this before to you, the idea that if we think about a game using different verbs, perhaps we can find different outcomes. And the verb colonialize or settle, those are verbs at the heart of the mythology of the progress of Europe throughout the world. The idea that there are these untapped resources as opposed to being used in a different way by the people who live there, and that we can go get them. And we're able to take them because of force, and that it is our right to do so. Like the manifest destiny idea, it is the right of white people to take over all of North America, and thus we did. As opposed to a broader sense of respect for different cultures and respect for the ownership that they have of those spaces. And so Australia engages with that. It allows us to have a situation where we can play out the colonialist perspective and not have to worry about the implications of that perspective. But I think that there is some worth in thinking about the implications of that perspective. Right? I have never seen a conversation about terraforming Mars that considers the idea that we shouldn't be terraforming Mars. We see human beings, we see ourselves as expanding, and the idea that yes, we should be able to go live on Mars, and if it doesn't suit us, we should change it so it does, is a big part of how we understand the world around us and how we understand the universe as a thing where we should be able to live. In some regards, that is an evolutionary mandate. We want to live in other places. One might also argue an evolutionary mandate is to come into balance with our environment and don't have more kids than we can support in the place we are, rather than expanding. The Western civilization tends to be focused on using and moving on, expanding. That is the philosophy at the heart of our project. But I think the colonizing game in itself, be it Australia or on Mars, has at its heart the idea that it is okay for us to go to a place and use it. And I think that's worth thinking about or talking about a bit more. Well, this was hopefully an interesting exploration into the weird mind of your host, Brendan Riley. You can let me know what you thought of it over on Board Game Geek and Guild 3269. I hope to see you there talking about it with me. Or you can reach out Brendan at Rattlebox Games, and I'm happy to correspond with you there. Thanks for joining me today. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.